Suffering is a gift. If you want to advance in the spiritual life, you must accept suffering as the gift and the blessing that it is. From the Spiritual Combat, Dom Scupoli, you must toil and make every effort, especially in the beginning, to embrace tribulation and adversity as your dear sisters, desiring to be despised by all, and to have no one who entertains a favorable opinion of you or brings you comfort but your God. Fix deeply in your heart the impression that God alone is your God, your only refuge, and that all things else are thorns to you, which will wound you if you press them to your heart. Suffering is a gift because it detaches us from creatures. We've discussed the three fronts of the war, the three enemies, the three weapons, and an overarching theme in the spiritual life must be suffering, which is detaching ourselves from the attachments to creatures. In particular, we talked about effeminacy, which is a reluctance to suffer because of an attachment to pleasures, which are, especially in the senses, in the concupiscible appetite, where we get attached to some pleasure in our concupiscible appetite, and that attachment grows in us so that we cannot suffer to lose it. And Scupoli also says that the measure of an attachment is when that thing is taken away if we are vexed in our spirit. So the overarching theme is to detach ourselves from creatures and adhere to God alone, because God alone is uncreated. God alone is charity. God alone is stable. God alone is unchanging. God is God, and in Him alone we have our rest. Now, we take pleasures, as we've said in previous video, through the virtue of eutrapelia, which is a moderated use of pleasures for their proper use, which is recreation. But in the spiritual life, if we want to overcome our predominant fault, which is one of the three fronts, we must detach ourselves from creatures. So the three enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil, make use of our attachments to creatures, whether we are attached to human praise or particular pleasures of the concupiscible appetite. Whatever our attachment is, that attachment is what binds us to our predominant fault. That's our chain to our predominant fault. So breaking the attachments through suffering is the key to the spiritual life. That is how you advance, by embracing suffering. So we talked about suffering in prayer when you're dry, and to not be effeminate by being attached to those pleasures in the false gospel of psychology, which is all about just getting good feelings. Your feelings are included in prayer, but they're not the focus. The focus is lifting the mind and heart to God, mind and will to God, that is. And that includes your emotions, but sometimes it may not include your emotions if you're dry. So then your predominant fault is keeping that detachment. So breaking the chain of your predominant fault is suffering and accepting that tribulation so that you can be detached from your predominant fault. And the spiritual reading, the third pillar, that is your reinforcement, your refreshment. So I just read from one of the classic texts, Dom Scupoli, The Spiritual Combat. Take a look at the links. There's resources for spiritual reading, the classic text. If you haven't read any of the classic texts, take a look at one of those. Get them for Septuagesima for Lent. Septuagesima is February 9. That's the 3-week pre-Lenten period. So prepare yourselves, brethren. Get yourself ready for the great fast of Lent so that you can advance in the spiritual life and fight against the enemies of Holy Church, which are the world, the flesh, and the devil. In this way, first, we must ground ourselves so that then we can take on the lesser enemies, which are evil in the church in the form of men who have taken it over. We need to start with this so that we can be truly filled with charity and truth, so that we can take these men on with holiness instead of with a depraved mind, which is attached to creatures. So we detach ourselves from creatures, we can also face the suffering of this church, of the church crisis, as our fathers did, manfully taking up the cross like saints, taking up the suffering and accepting it, and accepting it as a blessing, because that is what God has given you this day. And in this time, we need to accept the suffering, be detached from creatures, find our refuge in God alone, and hope in Him for the deliverance, and for the deliverance in our children. So brethren, accept suffering, accept it, love it. Give thanks to God for this blessing of suffering. That is the key to advancing in the spiritual life. And it takes time. But be patient. God is faithful. He will give you the graces to advance. Keep your mind on Him and hope in Him.